Around. He's like, I'm out, y'all. So we'll start in like a minute and a half. How about that? And I can finish chewing my food. All right, y'all. I think it's about time. So it's a big day. So this is a space. Gonna have to figure out how to work in this space. All right. Well, before we go any further, how about we have a prayer? The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, you have called us to grow in wisdom and in grace, and you have promised to help us with that. So this morning, as we spend some time learning about the Bible, about the New Testament, about what it is to be a follower of Jesus, we ask that you would accompany us on this journey. Guide us, teach us, show us the way, that we may follow closely along behind you and look more like you. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so before I go much further, I want to make sure I introduce Mark Grafton, who is also going to be helping out. I know. Mark, you guys have been coming since, January? So you're not really new anymore. I mean, that's not new. Anyway, so Mark is going to be talking. So y'all, originally when we planned this, I was not going to have been sick last week. And so last week was supposed to be Journey Through the New Testament, and then today was supposed to be dedicated completely to resources and, how do you read the Bible on your own and all that kind of stuff. So I wasn't here last week, so we've had to cram these two sessions together. And so we're going to do our level best to cover all the stuff, plus have plenty of time to talk about resources and answer questions. And so that's our goal. So bear with us. So I want to tell you first why I picked, hello live stream people. This is very exciting to be the first live streamed adult formation. So hopefully the live stream can see the slide. Perfect. So I picked this. This is kind of a funny picture to have on the front slide of an adult class, but I'll tell you why I picked it. I picked it because it has, well, first of all, people are looking very joyful, and I feel like those of us that are trying to follow Jesus on our best days feel a lot of joy, right? Because that's what the Lord inspires of us. I also picked it because there are men, women, and children in the picture, right? So all kinds of people follow Jesus, right? We mostly hear about adult men, a few adult women, and then not really much about children, right? Although Jesus does say, let them come to me. But if you think about what it would have been like to live in the time of Jesus in a town where Jesus was roaming around and doing his thing at every town he went to. There would just be people, right? There would be people. There would also be animals running around. Like, it would just be this big, crazy mess in the best sense of all of the creatures of the Lord, right? And so that was really important to me, that all of the folks that would have been followers of Jesus in the broadest sense of that term were represented in the slide, right? And when you find a cartoon, it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of fun. Come on, there we go. Okay, so this is just, man, we're gonna see if we can do this quickly. This is just gonna be sort of, here's the broad overview of what is in the New Testament, right? 2 weeks ago, was that 2 weeks ago? Yes. My husband, Steve Bishop, came and did the overview of the Old Testament in, very, very broad strokes. So we start with the 4 Gospels, and I just love this. So the word gospel means good news in Greek, euangelion. I was going to write it up there, but that was going to be too hard. But I think this is so neat. So it's the same word that was used to announce the coming of the emperor, right? So there's a particular kind of good news when the king or the head of the state comes, right? The gospel writers sort of subverted that and said, actually, the real bringer of the good news is Jesus, right? And Jesus was bringing a pretty different message than that of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire did a lot of good things. We are very grateful, roads, aqueducts, all that stuff. But it was also it was good for a very few, and it was terrible for a lot of people. For peasants, for folks who didn't have status, it was really rough, right? And those were a lot of the folks that Jesus was living with and ministering to. And so to say, here comes the good news, pointing to Jesus, right? That's right? You can see we're right off the bat, maybe there was going to be some trouble, right? If you think about what the empire wanted, empire power, and then the power that comes through the cross, like Matt talked about this morning in his sermon. Totally different, right? So I love that. So we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 different takes on the ministry of Jesus, what he came to do, and who he came to do it for, right? So, there are variations in the Gospels. Some of them are the same story. I mean, there are lots of the same stories in each of the Gospels, but in some cases they are presented a little bit differently. It's too much writing, I know. This is really for me, so that I don't forget what I want to say. All right, we've got the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning viewed together, right? That's lovely, right? So we get a fuller picture of the stories of Jesus when we read these 3 together, right? So Matthew's going to tell us something, Luke's going to tell us something, Mark's going to tell us, again, sometimes they tell us all the same things, but sometimes there will be a story that Matthew has that Mark doesn't have. Matthew and Luke are a lot of the time pretty similar, but there's some characteristics in Luke. So when we think about the gospel, I think it's okay to have a favorite. I mean, I kind of have a favorite, all right? But I'm going to do better understanding who Jesus is when I encounter him and his teachings through all the gospels, right? It's like holding up pieces of a window, right? We see better when we see the whole stained glass together. Does that make sense? So Mark was written first. When the dates, I mean, these are kind of the best guesses, but definitely Mark was written first. It is short and to the point. It has a sense of urgency. One of its key characteristics is this phrase, and immediately. And I used to know what it was in Greek, and it just left my head. But there's this sense of like, we've got to go, we've got to move, we've got to do this thing, the end of the times are coming, and there's work to be done, right? And even after it was clear the end wasn't coming in the way that early followers thought, there was still this sense of urgency of people need this message, right? And we cannot waste time, and we don't need any fluff, we don't need any of this beautiful language like Luke adds and all these poems and all that. So Mark is to the point, right? It's short. Matthew and Luke took parts of Mark's gospel and then added some other stuff, right? And this is why it's great to encounter all of them together, because we can appreciate some of the things about, I think Mark's gospel is really neat because of that. It's like no fuss, no muss, right? But then I would hate to not have the beauty of Luke. I mean, we wouldn't have, if we just had Mark, we wouldn't have a birth story of Jesus, right? We would have a crucifixion and a resurrection and a lot of other good stuff. We wouldn't have parables. So we would be missing some stuff, right? But so Matthew and Luke's version smooth out some of Mark's rough and urgent sounding sentences. Matthew imagined that he was telling stories and writing to a predominantly Jewish audience, and Jesus sort of figures as a new Moses, right? People would understand, Jewish folks would understand who Moses was, and so to say, this is kind of like Moses plus, right? Plus. And we have the Sermon on the Mount. Some of this is just stuff that I thought would be interesting to call attention to. Luke was written to expand the gospel to Gentiles. Gentiles is like another way of saying all the nations, right? So it's anyone who wasn't Jewish. So a lot of Greek citizens, right? So Luke's point is to say Jesus came for everyone. Salvation is open to all people in the greatest sense, right? And so it's an expansive gospel. Luke, the person who wrote Luke, also wrote the book of Acts. And so that makes sense when you think about the book of Acts is all about spreading, right? Taking the good news of God to all the nations, right? As far as they could possibly go, right? And they went pretty darn far, especially considering, right? Great. So prodigal son, the walk to Emmaus, resurrection account, Good Samaritan, those are all classic sort of Luke stories. Both Matthew and Luke have birth narratives for Jesus, but they're very different. Has anyone put them side by side and kind of looked at what's interesting about them? Yes? Well, that is an exercise I will commend to you, right? That would have been a good, yes, homework. That's your homework. Please come next week with a report, written, double-spaced, 12-point font. All of the gospel, all three of the synoptics have a crucifixion account. Matthew's and Luke's resurrection account are similar, and Mark's original ending is different. So Mark has two endings. This is very interesting. It has the ending that they think is the original ending is not. It does not end with the glorious Jesus and everyone's so excited. It ends with the women being terrified, right? I mean, which also kind of makes sense, right? And then sometime after the gospel had been around for a while, people were like, nah, that's not a very good ending. We gotta do something about that. And so then there was a second ending added that's much more similar to the other two gospel endings. So that's also kind of interesting, right? It's like we're not comfortable with this sense of, so Mark ends with them being terrified, but Jesus is also like, you'll find my people. No, you will find Jesus in Galilee where he said he was, right? So Jesus isn't here because he's raised, and also he's out doing the work, so go. Get out there and do the work, right? We want to stand around and think about how amazing the resurrection is. Jesus is like, okay, great, and let's go, right? There's work to be done. There's people to love on. There's people to feed. There's people to teach the good news to. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Mark, do you want to add anything? Putting you on the spot here. It's like, this is not my part. No. Okay. Anybody have any questions or comments so far about our synoptic gospels? Anybody have a favorite gospel of these three? Maybe your favorite one's John. We haven't talked about it yet. You like them all the same? Yeah, Luke is beautiful. Yeah. Is there something particular about it that? Yeah. Yes, Linus saying the lines. Yes, that's right. Well, we're certainly, so familiar with, so much of the Christmas story in all of it, leading up to it, and then the day of, is from Luke, and it's lyrical, it's very poetic. You could almost, there are actually, I was going to say, you could almost put it to song, and there are portions in there that are hymns, right? That are, the Song of Zechariah and the Magnificat, Mary's song. They're just really beautiful. Yours is Mark. Yes, mine too. Yeah. Oh, wow. What a neat memory, Miranda, and what a neat practice. Yeah, so you associate Mark with her and spending time with her. That's great. Anyone else? Favorite? Matthew? Okay, yeah, right. Classic. So you're happy we're in the year of Matthew right now. Heading towards Mark. Okay, cool. Okay, John. I don't know if y'all can see this picture. It's got these, probably I'm breaking a copyright by posting this, but I'm not going to sell it. But this is a cartoon of them, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, which we find in John. Washing the disciples' feet, and here's the communion vessels. Can y'all see that? So the foot washing that we reenact on Maundy, Thursday, and the institution of the Lord's Supper, which also big, Maundy, Thursday, those are both found in John. I love this picture too, because as you can see, there's some women in the back. So I think that's kind of neat. Were there women at the, first Last Supper? I don't know. It doesn't name them. That doesn't mean they weren't there, right? That's, what? Did they eat? Yes. There were certainly women there because they had food. That's right. That is exactly right. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so that was funny. That's funny. A funny picture. So John is, I called it a different approach. So it's the latest of the four Gospels, written probably around 90, definitely the latter part of the first century. It has what's called a high Christology, so it really emphasizes Jesus' divinity, right? Mark is probably the one that emphasizes his humanity the most, and John is the one that really emphasizes his divinity. He's certainly human and divine in all of them, right? But in John, he is very much the Christ, right? Prologue, you might be familiar. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was with God and was God. Yes, right? That word is logos, right? Which is Greek. People would feel like, that's so interesting. It's this wisdom kind of business. I love the prologue. I think it's gorgeous. It has the I am sayings, right? Already covered foot washing, institutional Lord's Supper. It has a crucifixion and a resurrection account. All four Gospels do. And the crucifixion account in John is always read in the Good Friday liturgy. Okay, the one that's read on Palm Sunday is it rotate, Matt? He's not listening. I caught you out. I think it rotates based on the year, or is it the one that's read on Palm Sunday? Thank you. Yes, good. That's right. I don't know why I only ask the priest. It's not like ordained people always have the answers. Clearly. No, just kidding. That's right.
That's why I wasn't listening. I have all the
That's exactly right. That's right. Yeah. So, but always in the Good Friday liturgy, you have to read the John account, right? So that's interesting, right? So if you come to both the Palm Passion Sunday, and Good Friday, you're going to hear two different accounts, right? I encourage us to come to both of those services because they're a little bit different. They do different things, along with all the other services of Holy Week, right? That's going to be I look so forward to being here with y'all for that. That's going to be exciting. And God willing, I'll be a priest at that point. So that's like, phew, I'm going to get to sit down some, right? Anybody want to say anything about John? Yeah.
It's funny that John 3:16 is the most, familiar with the general population.
Yes. I didn't even put that up there. Good grief. That is right. Yeah. Thanks in part to the people who stand up at the football games, right? And have the banners that say John 3:16. Right. Yeah. Right. Anyone else about John? Do what? They do? Did y'all know that? The cups from In-N-Out Burger have John 3:16 on them? What? I don't ever go to In-N-Out Burger. That's probably why. No, not that I'm opposed. We're not going to have a fight about which are the best burgers. Okay, good. Do you feel like John is your favorite gospel? Anyone? Yeah. Woo, look at that. We got several takers on that. Why?
Well, because I love the way that it starts.
Yeah.
And I love just like you said, that's what we always read on Good Friday.
Yeah.
It's my favorite part. And I love his account of the resurrection and of the crucifixion.
Yeah.
To me, those are just, I don't know, I just think those are the best
Yeah.
parts of the whole thing.
Yeah, very thorough, right? And Mary Magdalene is the one who sees and then goes and tells. John's resurrection account, you can't beat it.
No, you can't, and because it has the women in it.
Yeah.
Which I think played a lot larger part of the whole thing than is what is written.
Yes.
The ones writing it.
100%.
I know that they were there, and so I just think I just like John.
Yeah.
And, growing up, that was the gospel that my daddy would always read. That was his favorite, so we would always read John.
Yeah. Oh, good. I love that. Another family association. Good. Great. Cool. Awesome. These are such great stories. Okay, Acts of the Apostles. So written in probably the 80s or 90s, and this is the spread of what we would call the church. And this is really a story of diaspora, of spreading out, of going where it's not comfortable, where it's unknown, where it's risky. I'm looking around. I know some of y'all have done some of this, right? The Lord has called you to new and fantastical places that you weren't sure you'd ever even heard of, and certainly that you didn't necessarily think you would ever go, right? And that can be like literal, like different part of the world, but it could also be a different job. It could also be a different configuration of your family. It could be a different configuration of your health, right? God calls us into kind of wilderness and what can feel like exile sometimes. And along the way, we might spread the good news and also encounter God in new ways, right? So that's what this story, I always like to call it made for TV movies. That's kind of an antiquated thing, but like when I was little and before we had like all the streaming services, there would be like these epic dramas, and there was like, you could always tell like, oh, this is for people who were watching it at home, but it's very exciting, and it's drama, high drama, epic sagas, right? And I just think this is really neat. So part of Acts 2:42, you could probably quote it. But part of the language from Acts is in our baptismal covenant. Will you continue in the breaking of the bread, and then the fellowship and the prayers, right? Basically, will you not just go to church, but be a part of the body, right? And Mark's going to talk a little bit more about that Acts 2 part. So Acts is really, it's such an exciting I mean, it's kind of like if you are just starting to read the Bible, this might be a really cool place because there's like tons of miracles and chains falling off and doors busting open and prisoners being freed and thousands of people coming to the Lord in one fell swoop. It's like the evangelical preachers like hallmark, right? Like this, but that we could all didn't that happen today? I mean, didn't we experience like? I mean, of course we did. Maybe not in that dramatic of a way, right? So Acts is a pretty neat book. Okay, so epistles, otherwise known as letters to the churches, 21 in total. The most important thing that I like to highlight with these letters is that every one was written to a specific audience, right? So now that does not mean that we can't learn from them. We certainly can. But the letter to the Philippians was written to the church, the baby, tiny, just beginning church in the city of Philippi, right? Ephesians was written to the people, the baby, tiny, young church in Ephesus, right? And so we can understand these letters better when we know, oh, Corinth, interesting, that was a port city. There was a lot, it was cosmopolitan. There were a ton of different ethnicities and nationalities and people groups, and it was like happening, right? So like they were having some trouble in their church and Paul had to address it, right? So the more we know about what was happening, the better an appreciation we can have for each letter, but then also maybe find ourselves, like when I worked at St. David's, especially kind of when I first got there, which was 2008, like Austin was experiencing another boom, and the church was growing, and it was kind of crazy. We had all different kinds of people, and it was really neat to kind of read about another, like a church in Corinth who was experiencing some of the same kind of growing pains, right, that we were experiencing, and just to kind of see, like, how did they navigate this? What were their pitfalls, right? So some of the ones that were written by Paul, I mean, some of the ones that say all of these right here, these undisputed and disputed, Paul's name is given to them. But from scholarship and other technical things from biblical archaeology and just this tone, rhetoric, all of that, it really seems like some of them were written by Paul and some of them were written by someone else, but in Paul's name, which is not actually plagiarism as we as we know it now. I mean, but that was a very common practice, right? That was a very common practice back then. So they would have been written by someone who either had known Paul or knew people who knew Paul, right? But some of these were later, and anyway, that's just kind of an interesting thing. To me, if we are talking about we have the Bible as a canon that we as Christians have to wrestle with, good, bad, and ugly, if I, in my own self, worry too much about who wrote what and who didn't write what and whether or not I'm going to ascribe more authority to that, then I'm going to keep running into trouble, right? Because that's not the point. God used human beings to write these things, and some of human beings' foibles got put into the letters, right? So it's not so easy as to say like, oh, great, I like all the things that they say. I like all the things that Paul says about women and the ones that he wrote, period, the end. That's not true, right? That doesn't solve the problem if you're talking about women in leadership. There's some things that Paul says even in Corinthians that are maybe a little bit troubling, right? So we take the Bible as a whole, we wrestle with it. That is one of the things that I love to do best in this work is wrestle with the text, right? We're in it, we're doing it. Oh my gosh, Mark, I promise I'm gonna leave you time. Okay. Y'all, this is so fun. I love Revelation. I just love it. So, Book of Revelation, Apocalypse of John, written towards the end of the 1st century. So apocalypse means disclosure or unveiling, right? and I just am going to read this because I wrote it and I think it's good. It celebrates the power of God over death and the promise of hope in the midst of contemporary situations of suffering and oppression. So the situation that was happening when we think that Revelation was written was really about it's just what Matt mentioned earlier, the ways of Roman Empire power clashing with what people believed Jesus was calling them to do, right? Believed that it was not okay to worship the emperor because God says you will have only one God, and it is me, not this man in a crown, right? Even if he was amazing and did great things. That was hugely problematic for the empire, right? If the empire wants full allegiance and you're giving your allegiance to something else, that is no good, right? From the empire standpoint, right? So that's a lot of what this is. I read this in a really great commentary. The ways of life that the Roman Empire required must be rejected. And when you do that, things are going to get hard, but there's still hope. And that's I would suggest the lens through which we read Revelation. There's a lot of lenses, right? You've probably all heard different ones. That's the lens that I invite us to read, because that also translates to now, because we all are struggling with something, some people way more than others, right? But what we proclaim, and we proclaim this every single Sunday, that we follow a resurrected Lord. We follow a crucified, but a resurrected Lord, right? And that's what Revelation says over and over and over again, with crazy images and lambs with a lot of eyes and locusts and plagues and dragons, and it's a cosmic battle, right? Cosmic battle. Okay, whew, we did it. Mark, tag in. Thank you.
Is this working or not?
Oh, we should turn it on. We should make it work.
Yeah, the door's still on.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah.
We want you to be amplified.
Okay. Oh, no, it's working. So I get the enviable position of following Father Matt, Deacon Amy, and then being right before lunch happens. And having been asked this week to take something that was supposed to be 40 minutes and put it into like 5 to 7. So hopefully I can do that. And so we want to talk some about resources and how do you go about reading the Bible and what are some things that are out there. But Deacon Amy really asked me to say, like, what does the Bible mean to you? And I think that leads into why we want to have resources and what kind of resources we want to have. And so, I can't tell you about what the Bible means to me without telling you about what the favorite part of the Bible to me is. And that's a real small section in there. It goes from John chapter 20 to Acts chapter 2. And it's a part that we don't talk about in church very often. Matter of fact, I can't remember a single sermon being preached on this part of the Bible, but there's some incredible things that happen then. If you'll remember, in John 20, Jesus has been resurrected, hasn't left the earth yet. That happens in Acts 1. And there's a story of Peter. So you guys remember Peter, who does everything and becomes, really what the church is. But at this point in time, we find Peter is a broken man because what had just happened to him? Yeah. He thought, hey, I'm going to be the guy. I was told I'd be the cornerstone. I'm going to be the person, and he falls flat. And there's this beautiful story of Jesus coming and asking Peter, do you still love me? And I think that Jesus knew that Peter loved him, because you don't cut off a soldier's ear in front of him without loving Jesus. But I think who Jesus needed to realize that he loved him was Peter, because he had some plans for Peter. And if you'll notice, what happens right then is that he quits calling Peter a fisher of men and starts calling him a shepherd. So he speaks into him his destiny, right? And it's such a neat thing because, like Father Matt talked about this morning, the gospel is this taking brokenness and turning it into something beautiful. And it's what we see right there in that story. And so it's such a neat thing. But that's not the end of the story. See, what happens next is that Peter, we have the day of Jesus goes, and then we have the day of Pentecost comes. And the Holy Spirit's flowing around. People think everybody's drunk. Peter gets up in front of everybody and starts preaching. It says that he uses words to convince people, but it's preaching, I guess. And as far as we know, for this new church, this is the first message that's preached. And guess what Peter talks about? Guess what he does? First thing he does is he reads from the Old Testament, the book of Joel. Reads what the prophet said that Jesus was going to do. Second thing he does, reads a psalm. Talks about what King David spoke about God and his mercy. Third thing he does is he proclaims the gospel of Jesus Christ, what they had just seen happen. Does that sound familiar to our church service? Yeah. And so we have this beautiful thing where that happens, and it says, the funniest part to me is that then it says actually in translation that then he used some other words to try to convince people. My guess is that that's the part where it's the sermon. Nobody remembered anything that Peter said that was of his own. They remember all the stuff that God said, right? But I think what's really neat that happens there is that it says that, I think it's in the King James Version, it says that the words pierced their hearts. It pierced their hearts. And then 3,000, it says, came to be baptized and to know Christ. These were our first followers, really. But if you dig further into that, they only counted men. So it's more like 9,000 probably. We don't even know an instance in the Bible where Jesus brought 9,000 people into the fold in one day. But Peter did by doing what? Reading the Bible with the power of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So this is really, to me, an important part for me. And for my own personal story, the reason why I love reading books of the Bible is I started reading this, and this came up in a devotional that I was reading. I think it was Max Lucado at the time. This came up during a really tough time for me. I'd felt like Peter. I had thought, hey, I tried and failed, and guess God's not going to use me for much, but I'll piddle along and do whatever. And I came across this, and what I started understanding was this isn't a book about ancient people who had weird problems over in Middle East somewhere. Noah got drunk at times, and it wasn't these strange things that happened. These were people just like me. And this is a story of God's unending love for us that continues to go on. And it continues to search us out no matter where we're at. And then the good news is, and the great news is that because of the cross, and it's funny that I was going to talk about this on Holy Cross Day, because Methodist Church, we don't do Holy Cross Day, so didn't know that growing up. But if you look at this and this story, and it's this great thing about this taking brokenness and turning it into beauty. And isn't that really the power of the cross? Isn't that really the power? We talk about the resurrection. We're almost done. So if we go from there and talk about some of the different things, so kind of covered that and the things that we wanted to go through. I almost got it underneath. Almost got it underneath. But resources that we have, I want to talk a little bit about those. But the first one is there was a study done by Lifeway, which is, Courtney knows Lifeway because she grew up in the Baptist church. But they did a study, and it basically said, hey, Americans love the Bible, and they think it's the greatest thing ever. And what they did when they went in and looked at this is they found out that over half of Americans had read very little or none of the Bible at all. So it's pretty appropriate, that's, we say we love things, and then we don't actually take the time to go find out why we love them. So I thought today I'd give you some things that make it easier to go about. Now, one of the things that I recently, in the last 6 months, have really started using is a day-by-day app on the phone. I don't know how many of you use that, but Forward Movement, if you go there, the little books they give you when you visit the first Sunday, they give you this little devotional book. It's Forward Movement, and Day by Day is an app that actually goes through the liturgy of what we're going to be speaking about on Sunday, and you've got a devotional. You can do a prayer in the morning. You can do a prayer in the evening. You can even, if you're driving like I do, set it for it to talk to you and go through and do it from an audible standpoint. So that's a pretty neat one. Another one that you can look at is the Bible app, or if you go do Bible.com, it's a group. It's essentially, you can go in and pick whatever version of the Bible you want and read that particular version. You can go in and search and do some different things. There's also Bible Gateway, which is another one. Bible Gateway is kind of cool because you can go in and pick a part on there where it translates different words into Greek or Hebrew for you. So if you want to get into studying more like that, and it's searchable too. So it's like, was there ever anything about blood? You can put blood in, and it'll find verses that have to do with that. So some pretty neat verses there. And then also, there's the good old written book, It doesn't have to be on your iPhone or on the computer. And one of the things I would encourage you to do on that too, and several people have mentioned things that, family, different books of the Bible tied to their family. But one of the things I'd encourage you to do is write in your Bible. When you come across verses and things, one of the things that was really a blessing when my mom passed was being able to look at her Bible and see the things that she had written down. A little disturbing on how many times she prayed for me, so, but, it is what it is. Didn't realize I was that far off the realm, but anyway, so writing those things down, because not only for your kids when you pass it on or other family members, but also when you come back to it and you're in a different spot in life and reading the things that, I was telling Courtney the other day, I pulled my Bible out, and this one's like 35 years old. My mom gave it to me when I was 18. And back when I was in the Methodist church and sometimes I would speak, I would use this Bible. And I wrote some things in the margins, and I was reading some of those, and I was like, wow, Courtney, I actually was hearing from God, because I'm not smart enough to have figured these things out on my own. So those are all really good things to be looking at, and some good practices to do as far as going in for resources. Amy, you want to talk a little bit about versions and then wrap us up from there?
Yeah, that was so, thank you, Mark. That was beautiful. That was well done. Yeah, it's just so super quickly, and this is not actually a super quick conversation, but just to introduce it. Right, this is a question I get a ton. Which versions should I read? There's so many to choose from, right? So one of the resources that my husband, who actually is a Bible scholar, gave me had these categories. Literal, which it's always dangerous to use that, but their definition of literal is that these are versions that come closest to providing a word-for-word translation in terms of the grammar, vocabulary, and style of the original, right? So just for example, the NRSV that we read in church, the Bibles that we have in church, the NRSV, most Episcopal churches, at least in this part of the country, use the NRSV. The group of translators that worked on that translation was ecumenical, and it also included Jewish scholars, and so it's the most academic. It's accepted in academic circumstances, but it's also, we read it in worship. And the King James Version is also an example of this. So then we get into, they say, non-literal with extended vocabulary. So close, not quite as close to the original Hebrew and Greek and the context, but sort of if there's 3 levels, the second. So, but it's going to use a little bit more up-to-date vocabulary. So the NIV is a very popular Bible that people use. That would fall into this category, right? So it's not going to be quite as close to the original text, but closer than what they call non-literal with colloquial language, which I actually think that's helpful, the colloquial language part. So the message, right? Or when I was growing up, there was this thing called the Cotton Patch Gospel. Did y'all ever hear that? Yeah. So it is further away from the original language and meaning, and more in the vernacular that makes sense to us, right? So picking a Bible is there's a lot of things that go into it, right? Some of it is just familiarity. Some of it is, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons you would pick a different version. So, and that's a longer conversation we can have, and I'm sure Brother Matt would have that conversation too. And maybe there's Bibles that you read, when you're studying it by yourself that have like some notes. Anyway,